I'll just give the very broadest of one-sentence setups to my paper. I'm talking about Argo and Zero Dark 30. Especially Zero Dark 30 was very controversial, perhaps in ways that some of you may be familiar with the debate about whether or not it endorses torture. And so I'm drawn to it in part because of that and because of, I think, the way in which what I'm talking about hooks up with where Greta started us on Thursday, which was the hot day, with the argument against kind of moralizing readings of aesthetic politics. So in a very broad way, I'm going to look at these two films and try to make a claim that they are not or not only about what they seem to be about, and that we have to take that into account. And then I hope there's some broader political implications for the way we talk about films and other popular texts more generally. And so hopefully we can have that conversation. So I will just dive in from there. And I have a few clips. I need to learn how to make clips actually, but I will. I think we're all set as far as finding the places I want to be in. So, okay. The most controversial Oscar-nominated film of 2013 was easily Kathryn Bigelow's Zero Dark 30, about the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency's search for and eventual assassination of Osama bin Laden. A whole website helpfully catalogs and provides snippets from the many commentators, film critics, journalists, filmmakers, even U.S. senators, who criticized Bigelow and screenwriter Mark Boal for two main issues. First, for crafting a narrative that supposedly endorses torture as an intelligence gathering technique, and second, for allowing their filmmaking choices to be shaped by the CIA in return for access not usually granted to Hollywood filmmakers. The Guardian's Glenn Greenwald, outraged about the film as he is about more or less everything, slammed it even before it appeared, arguing on the basis of advanced reviews that it, quote, glorifies torture by depicting it as crucial to getting bin Laden, unquote, and thereby advances the Obama CIA party line, despite the fact that, quote, the film's glorifying claims about torture are demonstrably, factually false, unquote. Greenwald is interesting here, I think, for providing a baseline for what I would call naively political readings of a work, or what Greta earlier called moralizing readings. So readings that address the politics at a certain very basic level. After having seen the film and responding defensively to critics of his earlier piece, he offered the website I note above as, quote, a partial list of reviewers and commentators who made this factual statement definitively about the film, the factual statement being that it supported torture, and I read this quote with Greenwald's own emphasis on the phrase factual statement. And he further described the film's support of torture as a, quote, key factual question, unquote, and noted that the reviewers who argued that the film endorses torture were making, quote, factual claims and not value judgments. Of course, one might argue that the relevant distinction here is not between facts and value judgments, but between facts and interpretations. Greenwald is implying that Zero Dark 30's support for torture is an indisputable fact, or not just implying, he's actually using that language, beyond interpretation, a claim belied both by the point that others, Andrew Sullivan, Michael Moore, just to name two, have made the opposing claim, and by the detail that later in his piece, Greenwald himself offers textual evidence that his claim is true. He does a reading of the film to support the claim that it supports torture. Greenwald's insistence, however, on the film's factual support for torture, we might note, raises an interesting point or an interesting distinction about the kind of political claim that he is making. This point is resolutely content-focused and hinges on the film taking an explicit and readily discernible position on some issue. Similar but more muted criticisms greeted the other 2012 film involving the CIA that was nominated for an Oscar in 2013, and the one that was the eventual winner, Ben Affleck's Argo. Kevin B. Lee argued in Salon, for instance, that Argo glorifies the CIA's role in rescuing a group of US diplomats from the Canadian embassy following the 1979 takeover of the US embassy, while disregarding the way the agency, quote, helped create this mess in the first place, unquote, and this was perhaps the most frequently repeated criticism of Affleck's film, treating, quote, oppressed Iranians as a raging zombie-like horde, unquote. Such debates can be interesting and perhaps are rendered necessary in the case of these two films in particular by the CIA's seeming post-Cold War revival of interest in the culture industry, in addition to the fairly well-supported argument that the CIA had some say over the shaping of Zero Dark 30. Affleck received rare permission to film some scenes at the agency's Langley, Virginia headquarters. But these readings also, I would argue, nonetheless offer a kind of base level of political interpretation, one concerned primarily with specific issues and the specific positions that works take on them. And what I want to do then is to sort of push beyond that and to ask about other ways for reading the politics of works like this. So to do so, I take a slight detour here, and I want to talk about an essay by Adolf Reed. In an essay for the online journal Non-Site, he offers a very different account of another 2013 Oscar nominee whose politics, in fact, attracted relatively little commentary. Most of it was positive, Quentin Tarantino's Django Unchained. Reed takes to task academic and popular critics who praise Tarantino's film for its affirmative depiction of black agency, contending that the individualist way in which the movie depicts its protagonist's agency is totally in accord with the distinctly unliberatory politics of a dominant neoliberal capitalism. Grouping Django with Tate Taylor's 2011 movie The Help, Reed argues that both movies, quote, dissolve political economy and social relations into individual quests and interpersonal transactions, and thus effectively sanitize, respectively, slavery and Jim Crow by dehistoricizing them, unquote. Depicting slavery not as a means of profiting from labor, but as a framework for perversion and brutality, Tarantino also renders Jamie Foxx's character as someone who transcends this system through a triumphant individualism. Django cares only about his own wife, and in fact pointedly refuses to help another slave being torn apart by dogs because that might compromise his own mission. And Reed says, displacing a politics challenging social structures that reproduce inequality, with concern for the feelings and characteristics of individuals and of categories of population statistics reified as singular groups that are equivalent to individuals, the movie's generic story of individual triumph over adversity effectively reproduces the ideology at the heart of contemporary neoliberal capitalism. He goes on to say, the imagery of the individual overcoming odds to achieve fame, success, or recognition also maps onto the fantasy of limitless upward mobility for enterprising and persistent individuals who persevere and remain true to their dreams. As such, it is neoliberalism's version of an ideal of social justice, legitimizing both success and failure as products of individual character. And I think this actually bears in some interesting ways on the paper about Jonathan Franzen and the quote about you don't take into account the way that corporations are making life better for people. Reed would argue that that is the center of neoliberal ideology, and that things that look like they may be politically progressive and in favor of certain kinds of diversity are in fact still quite unprogressive in that they don't acknowledge the fact that the system is also designed to make most people poor and other people very wealthy. So I find this helpful, I think, because of the way in which that reading of Django can be flipped then to talk about Zero Dark 30 and Argo. If the problem with Django is its elevation of private voluntarist action as a politics, somehow more truly true or authentic, or at least more appealing emotionally, over the machinations of government and institutional actors, and that's a final quote from Reed, then perhaps that means that there is a different way of thinking about the politics of Argo and Zero Dark 30. Works that, if nothing else, are distinctly committed to the machinations of government and institutional actors. To dismiss this aspect of the movies because the main characters are CIA agents is, to my mind, the equally problematic inverse of praising Django solely because its protagonist is a black ex-slave. If Reed's reading of Django has merit, and I believe it does, then it matters that at least some Hollywood films do not in fact embrace an extreme anti-institutional individualism. We can certainly be critical of the CIA as a particular institution and of the way these films depict it without ignoring the overdetermined character of them as works of the imagination. And so here's where some version of the aesthetic, I think, is necessary. What if we imagine that the makers of these films also have some investment in imagining institutions and the people within them in a way not strictly reducible to capitalist free market individualism? And if we do so, further imagine that in the current moment the CIA provides, perversely, one of the few imaginative settings in which this project can be pursued. It's one of the few institutions that seems to have some affirmative character in a militarist US culture. So, we can't do it with unions, we sort of can't do it with other institutions, but the CIA then becomes a kind of focal point for these residual positive feelings or interested feelings about institutions. Many of the responses to Zero Dark 30 have noted the intransigence displayed by Jessica Chastain's character Maya in pursuing a goal that seems to be getting her nowhere, either casting this as some sort of obsession or pointing to the death of Maya's friend Jessica, played by Jennifer Ayala, as the thing that makes Maya's quest personal and thus acceptable. But what these responses forget is that pursuing unprofitable goals is what non-capitalist institutions make possible. Here we might do a thought experiment. What if Chastain played a scientist committed to unpopular research or an academic pursuing a project with no immediately profitable results? My point is that the narrative, if not the particular circumstances, would be the same. From this perspective, Argo provides the fantasy version of this allegory of institutional life, looking backwards in time to imagine a fantasy of the CIA as an institution that does nice things, like work with Canadians and rescue people. Zero Dark 30, meanwhile, provides the hard-boiled version that is willing to say that institutions also have dark sides, that they make life harder for women within them, for instance, or permit those who are committed to their goals to perform morally questionable acts like committing torture. To take up Reed's mode of argument, almost all of the critics of Zero Dark 30's torture scenes proceed under the auspices of a neoliberal logic of profit. Bigelow, they argue, would not show torture if she was not contending that it was effective. But perhaps within the framework of institutional allegory, what is fascinating about torture is the way that actors within an institution remain committed to it even when it doesn't work, and even when it is clearly sordid and dehumanizing. And I would argue that both of those claims are at least arguable within Zero Dark 30. What this means, I hope, is clear, is that the opposite of Reed's rigidly anti-institutionalist narratives of individualism is not an equally one-sided celebration of institutions, but rather simply a narrative that is interested in institutions and treats them as both useful and flawed. With this in mind, we might begin to counter the admittedly plausible argument that both Zero Dark 30 and Argo, imagined as narratives of a heroic protagonist struggle against the forces of institutional bureaucracy, in their own way reproduce neoliberal individualism. This certainly seems to be the case in the following scene that I'm going to show now, in which Maya argues with her superior, played by Kyle Chandler, who, interestingly, in addition to playing Joseph Bradley here, also plays the very similar role of Hamilton Jordan in Argo. So he's in both films as a kind of similar mid-level bureaucrat. And she argues with him for the resources she needs to continue her pursuit of Osama bin Laden. So let's look at this clip.
I really need to talk to you about beefing up our surveillance operation on the caller.
We don't have a surveillance operation on the call. Someone just tried to blow up Times Square, and you're talking about some facilitator, some detainee 7 years ago said Mike had been working with Al-Qaeda?
He's the key to bin Laden.
I don't fucking care about bin Laden. I care about the next attack. You're going to start working on the American Al-Qaeda cells. Protect the homeland.
Bin Laden is the one who keeps telling them to attack the homeland. If it wasn't for him, Al-Qaeda would still be focused on overseas targets. If you really want to protect the homeland, you need to get bin Laden.
This guy never met bin Laden. This guy's a freelancer working on the fucking internet. No one's even talked to bin Laden in 4 years. He's out of the game. He may well either be dead. He might as well be fucking dead. But you know what you're doing? You're chasing the ghost. The whole fucking network goes all around you.
You just want me to nail some low-level Mullah Packadola so you can check that box on your resume that says, while you were in Pakistan, you got a real terrorist. But the truth is, you don't understand Pakistan, and you don't know Al-Qaeda. Either give me the team I need to follow this lead, or the other thing you're going to have on your resume is being the first station chief to be called before a congressional committee for subverting the efforts to capture or kill bin Laden.
You're fucking out of your mind.
I need 4 techs in the safe house in Albany. 4 techs in the safe house in Peshawar. Either send them out or send me back to DC and explain to the director why you did it.
So this is the moment where Zero Dark 30 looks like the kind of film that Reed is talking about. It looks like the battle of the heroic individual against the stifling bureaucracy, right? The fact that Maya accuses Bradley of careerism is telling, insofar as it paints him as a bureaucratic time server who is simply getting by from day to day, in contrast with her own goal-driven individualism. I don't think this is an incorrect reading of this scene. Indeed, if Reed is right that neoliberal individualism is so dominant as to be treated as an unquestioned universal in our culture, then we should expect it to show up even in parts of narratives that try to swim against this stream. But it is an incomplete reading, I think. We might note, for instance, that the 2 characters are in fact not having an argument about the good or evil of the organization for which they work. They're both committed to the same organization, but rather an argument about how to allocate resources within it. Bradley favors preventing strikes on the homeland. Maya argues that this merely addresses symptoms and that the agency instead needs to root out the cause of these strikes. Moreover, Maya doesn't strike off on her own in action movie fashion, and there's a kind of generic distinction here that I think is important. Rather, Bradley does give her what she asks for, even if he does so in response to a threat to go over his head. And here we might note in passing that one aspect of a good organization is arguably the presence of checks against the top-down exercise of hierarchical power. So in some ways, we might actually see this scene as not a critique of bureaucracy, but some sort of affirmation of institutions. That Zero Dark 30 is in fact deeply committed to routinization, the kind of routinization that organizations and bureaucracies enable, is suggested by another scene, the one in which Maya's friend Jessica dies. This scene is based on the real-life Camp Chapman attack of 2009, in which a terrorist who seemed to be cooperating with the CIA used his access to the camp to carry out a suicide attack. And Bigelow adapts this for Zero Dark 30. In Zero Dark 30, the analyst Jessica believes that she has recruited a member of bin Laden's inner circle whom she can persuade through an offer of $25 million to reveal the mastermind's location. And she sets up a meeting at an airbase just outside Taliban territory. And so let me just quickly find this next clip. So this is the CIA, this is Jessica, and they're waiting at Camp Chapman for the person that she believes she's turned to arrive. These scenes run for a while without dialogue or without things happening, and I think that's actually intentional, and I'll talk about that in a minute.
Why are there gate guards there? We talked about this. No one is supposed to be there when my source arrives. You might have spooked him already.
The procedures only work if we follow them every time.
This is different. I'm sorry. I can't explain, but it's for a good cause.
Look, I'm responsible for everybody's safety, okay? It's not just about you.
I just need them to go away for a minute. You can search him as soon as he gets here.
All stations. This is Whiplash.
Go ahead and stand down.
Copy that.
Thank you.
Okay, he's coming. We're gonna search him when he gets here. Sure. Okay, let's go. Is he supposed to limp like that? Get your hand out of your pocket. Hey. Oh, come on. Hey! Get your hand out of your pocket! Hey!
That's a somewhat lengthy scene, but I think it's worth looking at because there are, I think interestingly, 3 modes of time in this scene. There's the mode of the waiting and the mode of procedure. There's also the mode of terrorism, which here I think actually less than the other representations of terrorism earlier in the film is about a kind of violent interruption from seemingly out of nowhere, so an unexpected interruption. That's the way that terrorist explosions, very loud terrorist explosions, take place in this film. Here we kind of have an inkling what's happening. Elsewhere they usually just come out of nowhere. People are having drinks in a restaurant or a tram is going down the street. That's good, that queued up where I wanted it to. And then finally the other mode of time is Jessica's desire to hurry things up. And so I think there's something actually interesting going on with that juxtaposition. By Hollywood standards, lengthy scenes of waiting here are, I think, designed to make the audience feel Jessica's own impatience and to endorse her desire to step over procedural speed bumps. But the logic of the scene obviously endorses the security officer's pain to rationalization. Procedures only work if you follow them every time. He's right. They should have followed the procedures here. And the movie, I think, is unambiguous about that. Moreover, Jessica, elsewhere in the film, directly represents the logic of capitalism, insofar as she believes she can turn the suicide bomber, the eventual suicide bomber, on the basis of money alone. In an earlier scene, she suggests, or in a very early scene in the movie, she suggests to Maya the possibility of paying al-Qaeda members to switch allegiances, an idea Maya dismisses as predicated on an outmoded Cold War logic. Here, however, Jessica believes that she is about to succeed with just this method. She tells one of her team members that $25 million is persuasive because that much money, as she says, buys a new life. She's obviously mistaken, however, and the implication is that in the post-Cold War era, America's enemies embrace a fanaticism that cannot be addressed with money, that cannot be swayed by money. It's worth noting, however, and interesting, I think, that Zero Dark 30 adduces money only as a possible means of swaying others. In a subsequent scene, and this is another sort of well-known scene from the movie, Maya's former mentor Dan successfully obtains information from another character in the Middle East by buying him a Lamborghini. It doesn't suggest that money is a motivator of any of the CIA characters. These characters, no less than their terrorist counterparts, are driven by their own commitments to an ideal. I think this scene suggests, however, the way in which the organization provides a mediating structure between terrorist fanaticism and pure economic self-interest, which are both forms of individualism in a weird kind of mirroring relationship. Maya and her CIA counterparts, as well as the SEAL team members who carry out the nighttime raid on bin Laden's compound towards the end of the movie, may well be motivated by an abstract patriotism, but the film and they themselves primarily treat what they do as a job. The narrative arc followed by Maya's mentor Dan is instructive here. The film's primary CIA torturer, he gives this task up when he becomes burnt out and he goes to Washington to take a desk job. And this isn't actually treated as abnormal or a problem in the movie. Here we might understand the occupational register not as an unidealistic compromise, but rather as a kind of break on the willingness to cross moral lines in the service of a cause that, for the film's terrorists, leads in a kind of inevitable narrative arc always towards the annihilation of self and others in the form of a suicide bombing. Dan, by contrast, only goes so far. He becomes burnt out, and then the inertia sort of built into the structure of his job leads him elsewhere. In an important way, then, the film posits the distinction between CIA agents and terrorists not as the reflection of a prior distinction between good Americans and evil others, but rather as the result of procedural safeguards. The movie's penultimate section, tellingly titled Tradecraft, effaces the distinction between CIA agents and terrorists even further, insofar as the tradecraft in question in this intertitle is not or not only that of Maya and her compatriots who use their skills to find Osama bin Laden, but rather it's invoked within the movie as the tradecraft of bin Laden's own people, whose use of rational procedures to avoid detection at various points alerts Maya to the very thing that it is attempting to hide. She recognizes that Osama bin Laden is in the compound because people are following procedures that would only be in place to keep somebody from being recognized. So in this act, the movie reveals its genre most completely. While periodically dipping into the territory of the action movie, the spy movie, and the war movie, Zero Dark 30 is most completely and comprehensively a police procedural. And here the question of the legal or police procedural that came up yesterday I think is relevant. We might do well to remember Christopher Wilson's point, the literary critic Christopher Wilson's point, that the police procedural's investment in professionalism and routinization must be read both realistically and ideologically, insofar as the genre is fundamentally invested in, quote, the interstitial position of the police, between law and the exercise of power, between the knowledge they gather and distribute, between their anger at social disarray, the order they must impose, and their sense of lost proprietorship over our cities. So in Wilson's reading, the procedural is always a genre about the relationship between rational procedures and the exertions of violence or kind of anger at a situation that they deal with. Zero Dark 30 demonstrates how easily these terms can be transposed onto the War on Terror. I think it actually works as a kind of perfect transposition if we understand the world instead of the city. In a police drama such as The Wire, moreover, we would recognize the movie's ambivalence about torture, Zero Dark 30's ambivalence about torture, as a standard feature of the genre. Good cops, after all, sometimes do bad things in the pursuit of admirable goals. So in other words, there's a generic logic to the way the movie displays torture that I don't think any of the critics have really talked about. But the movie's sincere commitment to procedure means that we can't read its proceduralism only cynically or ideologically. There's a scene late in the movie in which President Obama's national security advisor asks a CIA representative to prove that his organization has in fact found the hideout of bin Laden. The representative tells him, "You know we lost the ability to prove that when we lost the detainee program. Who the hell am I supposed to ask, huh? Some guy in Gitmo who's all lawyered up? He'll just tell his lawyer to warn bin Laden." Now, Greenwald and others have taken this line of dialogue as additional evidence of the movie's support of torture. Here again, it's the argument that you've made this harder because you've taken away torture. But I think that's only one way of reading the line. In fact, the line is, among other things, a clear invocation of the police procedural with the dialogue lawyered up. In that regard, we might do well to remember that in police procedurals such as Law and Order, such legal rules function as necessary narrative complications, a formal reflection of the ethical assertion that while they make the job of the police and prosecutors more difficult, they nonetheless have their value. And so this is, the sort of the role of Sam Waterston's character on Law and Order always, like we can't do this, it's crappy that we can't do this, but nonetheless it's important that we can't do this, as the kind of liberal voice on that show. The follow-up to this line in Zero Dark 30 suggests that Bigelow's film follows the same logic. The White House representative responds, "You'll think of something." And the CIA representative, in fact, does, returning with a tighter argument. We might thus read this line in context as making the opposite point from the one Greenwald claims, which is that torture is indeed unnecessary. It's not necessary. It can be worked around. Moreover, the solution to the problem of US involvement in torture is not to moralize about it, but to establish procedural rules against it. That's, in some ways, I think, a possible reading of this film's relationship to torture. If you don't want to torture, then put in place rules that you can't do it. If Zero Dark 30 is thus more complicated than critics like Greenwald would have it, it also presents something different from the anti-statism and anti-institutionalism that Reed tells us to expect in Hollywood films. Reed argues against the cultural studies position that, quote, the massive culture industry and its representational practices constitute a meaningful terrain for struggle to advance egalitarian interests, unquote, on the grounds that this view can be taken, quote, seriously only by ignoring the fact that the production and consumption of mass culture is thoroughly embedded in capitalist material and ideological imperatives. And so, Reed has a kind of theoretical argument against cultural studies and in favor of an older Adornian line about mass culture. Here I'm not really searching for signs of resistant agency in the way that I'm reading Zero Dark 30, in the manner that cultural studies might. But I am arguing that Hollywood films can do something besides reproduce the capitalist ideological imperative of neoliberal individualism. And this is the case, I would suggest, because while Hollywood films are certainly highly capitalized and thus invested in a very literal way in promoting the worldview of the capitalist system, they're also made, as their credits tell us, by large numbers of people laboring in a highly organized manner. One of the reasons that films like Zero Dark 30 and Argo cannot simply be taken as imagined representations of the CIA as an organization dedicated to US power or as ideological assertions of the value of neoliberalism is that their representation of organized professional labor is always on some level an allegory of the labor that produces them. So they're always in some ways allegorizing their own mode of production. This is, I think, even more clear in Affleck's Argo, whose story of a 1980 CIA operation to ferret US diplomats out of Iran using the cover story that they are Canadians, scouting locations for a science fiction movie also titled Argo, inevitably plays with the similarities between film producers and CIA operatives. Thus, in a line that appeared in the film's trailer, John Goodman, as makeup artist John Chambers, tells Affleck's CIA agent Tony Mendez, "So you want to come to Hollywood and act like a big shot without actually doing anything. You'll fit right in." But in fact, Argo takes this parallel as more than the setting for a joke. It takes it quite seriously. Affleck's movie takes the form of another genre of organized activity, similar to but distinct from the police procedural. And I was talking about this earlier, the heist film. The suspense of the heist film derives not from the attempt to find and punish a criminal, but rather from the effort to pull off a theft, in this case of people, in the face of both chance and equally capable enemies. To the extent that the heist is extremely complicated, if not downright baroque, it is even more a genre about work, about establishing procedures, following procedures, and coping when procedures fail. In the case of Argo, these procedures are both literally and figuratively akin to filmmaking. First, Mendez must lay the groundwork for his plan by going to Hollywood and doing the things that one would actually do in order to make a film, finding a producer, buying the rights to a script, holding a script reading, and so forth. Then, when he goes to Tehran, Mendez becomes a director of sorts. And this is brilliant, of course, insofar as the actual director, Affleck, is playing a character who is himself acting like a director, in a scene where he gives the diplomats copies of the Argo screenplay and he tells them that they must memorize their cover identities because, quote, "the only way this works is if you believe that you're these people so much that you dream like them." And so it's this really brilliant layered moment where he's playing a character who's also playing Affleck, giving the actors directions as well. The group then acts out a scene appearing in a crowded Tehran bazaar to prove to the government that they are who they say they are. And a late scene in the film in which the government decides to cancel the operation, I think, can also be read as a metaphor for a film losing its funding. So all the way through, there's a way in which you can understand this as also an allegory about Hollywood, as it makes very explicit, I think. Argo, that is to say, treats its manifest content, a 1980 CIA operation, as an allegory for its own processes of production, and both as products of the sorts of complex organized labor that takes place within institutions. Reading the movie in this way offers a somewhat different account of one of the film's main objects of criticism, its depictions of Iranians primarily as members of angry fanatical mobs. This depiction, given the film's historical context, is Orientalist or Islamophobic to be sure, although to the extent that the movie tends towards a kind of purely formal allegory of organized work, it also functions in another way, as I'd like to demonstrate with two more clips. In these clips, they're from the final act of the movie in which Mendez and the 6 diplomats encounter the final set of obstacles lying between them in a flight to Switzerland. In the first scene, they're interrogated by members of the Revolutionary Guard. And so let's just take a look at that.
خداحافظ. زمانش گذشت. زمان شاه گذشت، شما باهاش میرید. همتون. هیچ کدوم اینو دیزاین کار ندارن. نگاه کردی؟ نگاه کردی یا نه؟ دیزاین کار نداریم.
Sir, Bakarin, برای این فیلم درست هم میشنوید.
دیزاین ژورنالیست نداری؟
نه، تکنیکای نیست، فیلمه.
فیلم کیه؟
یک دستان، هیولیه، راجه بشه. tam یک دنیا دیگه. سی، آرگو فیلم ایران.
فارسی که بلدی؟
البته، فارسی بلدم. میخوام تو ایران فیلم درست کنم.
ایشون خانومه؟ نه. ایشون خانومه، بیا. ایشون شما این؟
نامش کنینه؟
نه. این خانوم ایشونه؟ با این لباس تو ایران؟ با این لباس تو ایران؟
No, I'm the writer.
Can you give me short list? این عکس نشون میده که جوری فیلم درست میکنه. دشمنان فضایی از پای اون میشنگه واسه زنان بخششون شاچون پس میگه دشمناس میدونن که اون منتخبه پیشارشون میدوستن توی یک سفینه خودش و زن است توی یک کامیون مردم اینو میگه مردم به او میده گجبانس هستن ولی او میگرن بیشنگه دشمناس خوشید میکنن شاه دشمنانشون از بین میره وقتی که مالون شاهینت دوست
باشه نمیریم تمام 양보한테 그래요?
That they are who they say they are, the setup verification. The group is then allowed to board their plane.
Partijopida, het komt van Argo.
برای سفر ماشینشو همه رو بازه کن. بله.
I think that's enough to make the point here, which is that the heist film as institutional allegory, I think here sets up the thing that Affleck and his people are doing as a kind of cool, calm proceduralism against both chance, which always operates in the heist film, so things inevitably go wrong that you're not expecting, but also in contrast with the opposite behavior here of the Revolutionary Guards. In that first scene, like the tradecraft section of Zero Dark 30, we get what is going on as a kind of chess game. The Revolutionary Guard leader speaks Farsi, the diplomat Stafford counters with his knowledge of Farsi and of the film that they're supposedly making. And incidentally, you can note that that film cleverly features a narrative of overthrowing a tyrant bound to be congenial to the Iranians. The guard leader, though, drops his pretense. He's clearly been able to speak English all along. He speaks fluent English, and he's done that to rattle the group. Mendez, Affleck's character, responds by giving him the number of the fake Argo production company. So it's a kind of back and forth of the two groups sort of playing against each other. But that breaks down in the second scene, where the guard members find out they have been tricked and, to put it lightly, don't respond well, crucially even for their own purposes. Mendez's response to the car not going or to the shuttle not going is to roll his eyes and kind of wait for it to happen. When something goes wrong for the guards, they flip out. The scene of one guard member running through the airport knocking over civilians and the other expressions of anger are clearly meant to contrast with the calm self-position displayed by Mendez when throughout the movie things do not work out as planned. And I could also note, if this had gone on a little further, there's a scene of an Iranian air traffic controller who's also following complex procedures. And so it's not, I think, totally a depiction of Iranians in general. Here, what looks like a kind of racist stereotype of fanaticism might also be read as an outburst of emotional, disorganized behavior. And the opposite of this behavior is not, moreover, individualism. It is staying calm and sticking to the plan. So I don't think we, should make this point in order to excuse Affleck from putting this kind of institutional allegory into a context where it is so overdetermined in problematic ways by the way that the US understands terrorists and people in the Middle East generally. But I do think it suggests the way in which the film is, in fact, hyper-concerned with kind of institutional procedure and is not the kind of neoliberalist narrative that Reed tells us to expect. And so to the extent that it can do something other than reproduce what Reed, I think, rightfully argues is the dominant narrative of the kind of contemporary moment of capitalism, I think there's a politics in these two films that we don't see if we look strictly at the surface level politics that they enunciate. Thank you very much.